Hi, Sebastian. How are you?
Doing well. Excited to be here.
We had you on, I was just checking, February last year, when Trump had just entered the White House. So we had a very well listened to episode at the time. But yeah, the world has moved on, and a lot of things have happened also in your life. And so we thought it would be good timing to get you back on. Maybe to start, like, how are you doing? Like, do you want to just catch us up? Like, what does your day look like now? Because obviously at the time you were doing something different.
Yeah, of course. I guess I had no clue what the world would look like today back in February of 2025. And oh boy, did I get a whole bunch of assumptions about where we were likely headed wrong. I think the situation when it comes to broader US diplomacy in the world is just far worse than anything I would have expected, as is the lack of coherent macroeconomic strategy. And those two headwinds have kind of overwhelmed anything that I would have expected to be able to happen when it comes to broader diplomatic engagement around carbon removal. The kind of thesis back then is, of course, this administration was going to be less friendly to carbon removal than the last administration, but maybe not that unfriendly. And maybe there would be this big kind of passing of the baton, if you will, where other countries were able to step up and fill some of the leadership roles that the US had been playing. And yeah, I think the world that we live in today, I would have never made those assumptions that would have been likely over the past year.
So, meanwhile, one of the projects that you worked on, and you reached out to many smart people while working on the project, was a government-led advanced market commitment for carbon removal, right? Because that's what we want to dig into in this conversation. But obviously, I'm sure the work on this was also impacted with everything else that was happening at the same time. Um, so to get us up to speed, because I'm sure not everyone has actually read the material that has been put out on this, can you just describe in general what were you trying to do? Because we would like to go through what were you trying to do and then what happened, right?
Yeah.
So what were you trying to do?
So the short answer is we were trying to get a group of governments around the world to commit to accelerating the demand for carbon removal by creating some sort of credible, bankable market signal that they would either buy or otherwise incentivize carbon removal. So think about this as basically what Frontier and Symbiosis are doing for the private voluntary market. Could we get something like that set up where governments are in the lead? And governments had done this previously in other sectors. In the global public health arena, the GAVI Vaccine Alliance is basically this model where a whole bunch of countries said we're going to pool our resources. It catalyzed the development of vaccines that otherwise wouldn't have had enough demand for industry to do by themselves. So it's a really cool idea. And everyone we talked to said it's a really cool idea. It just wasn't the right time for international multilateral coordination on new money commitments for removal. What I think actually happened was almost in a way surprisingly good, is that lots of other countries are now doing substantially more on carbon removal than they were 2 years ago. If you look at the policy frameworks in Europe, in Canada, in just many countries around the world, even in places like India and so forth, the amount of activity that's happening is substantial. But what isn't happening is everybody coming together in a harmonized and coordinated way. And for now, I think that's actually okay. I think there's a lot of work to be done. Eventually, we're going to need to do some things like agree on what types of carbon accounting standards we all think count. We're going to have to get 10x the amount of money into the field in order to actually make it accelerate in line with climate goals. But right now, we're kind of building those foundational pieces in a way that actually leaves me mildly optimistic that there's enough elements coming together that something like an advanced market commitment could be plausible in a couple years down the road.
So you think that as a concept, the AMC still holds? Because I come from global health previously, right? I worked a lot with GAVI, and GAVI, they solved a very tangible problem for a lot of countries, right? They literally saved children's lives in many cases, right? They were developing these vaccines that mean millions of children wouldn't die in a country. In this case, we're trying to pool these countries together, but what they get back is way less tangible, right? And so do you think that this, independently of the headwinds now, that this could work as a concept?
Yeah, I don't think it's less tangible. I mean, you're doing nothing short of potentially saving the world from climate change by kickstarting this industry. That's very tangible. I think the big difference is what you've identified as countries already wanted to do public health spending. They already wanted to buy vaccines. They just couldn't figure out how to do that well. We were not at that stage with carbon removal. They had not yet decided, yes, I want to make an investment. How do I do that most efficiently and with the greatest returns? And so I think that's what's going to need to change, is somebody's going to need to decide that they want to do this and they want to do it in a coordinated way. I also think that carbon removal is very broad. If you say, let's have a carbon removal advanced market commitment, it's almost like saying, let's have a global health advanced market commitment. Getting narrower really helps. Saying, maybe we want to do an advanced market commitment for ocean alkalinity enhancement, or we want to do something just for direct air capture. Picking a single technology might help, or even picking a small club of countries as opposed to trying to do everyone that we can talk to, basically. I think narrowing the scope starts to help, but it all goes back to that fundamental question of it needs to come from the countries demanding it. It can't happen. It can't make the countries want to do something they don't want to do, basically.
Super interesting insights. When I first heard about the idea, and having, also myself worked in the government for many years, I thought, well, I am skeptical, but I tend to be always more conservative in terms of what is possible, and I have been proven wrong before by very capable people who can do more than that I think is possible. So my take was, well, if anyone can try to pull this off, then you definitely have the drive. And if you cannot pull this off, then it means that potentially it wasn't the right time as described, or there was another very, very specific limitation. But I was optimistic knowing that you are kind of behind this initiative and behind trying to make it happen. So besides doing the general exercise, more theoretical exercise that is now available in this report, and mapping out all these different options, how to do it, design options for this advanced market commitments. I assume that you were talking to the governments, right? Because that's where you kind of got to hit. So how many governments did you actually end up having a conversation with about this?
Probably around 24, I would say, mostly across the OECD set of countries. Initially, the thinking was potentially the G7 could be a forum for this, or under the theory that it's almost certainly going to be the wealthier countries that are willing to pay for carbon removal soonest. That's what we've seen if you look at who's doing significant policy work on that space. So that we basically tried to talk to as many of those countries as we could, especially those that are climate forward and have a history of at least research and development in this space.
How close or how far did you get from your goal?
Well, in some sense, I think we didn't get anybody to sign up for it, right? So it's not real. But I just think that we completely misread where we were in the political journey. And one of the things that has come back to me is the history of the renewable energy space. The national and the kind of subnational even policy change far preceded any sort of international collaboration on that front. And we're just very far behind, even at a national or subnational level, on creating a bankable market for removal anywhere. So there's a lot of good subsidy programs out there, but they're mostly one-off. There's no government policy anywhere that actually creates a bankable demand for carbon removal in a meaningful way. And I think when you look back at renewables, wind, solar, etc., every one of those technologies had subsidies. Yes, like that was really important. But what got them to commercialization is there was some government somewhere who said, you have to buy renewables. There's a feed-in tariff in Germany. There's a RPS mandate in Massachusetts and California and other US states, right? And they were small, but they were willing to actually pay what it costs for the technology. And we don't have that anywhere for removals today. There's no ETS system that says you need to have 1% of the credits be removal or have some sort of payment that actually gets this to scale. There's a lot of kind of one-off systems. You see reverse auctions for subsidies in the Nordics and a contract for difference that's individually negotiated in the UK. The US 45Q is close to being that, but no direct air capture project costs $180 a ton, right? It costs way more. So you still need something above that subsidy. And there's no framework anywhere where the math actually works today for a market to exist. And so I think if we can get that happening, then the international coordination to really scale up some of those markets becomes much more plausible.
And taking just a step back to something you said before, you said that it's probably going to work better next try around when it's going to be more specific. Was it because governments, obviously different countries have different potential for different CDR methods in their territory, and the countries just want to focus on different CDR methods, hence it's difficult to go with something very general and get many of them sign up? Or like, was there anything else that you kept hearing from the governments besides that, whoa, like you're just way too early with this, we are trying to figure it out nationally first?
Money, that's it, right? So if you need new money for this, that was largely off the table last year in basically every context. There was no government out there who was in a position where they could ask for new funding without getting an offset somewhere and saying, we're going to take funding from this and use it for this. And carbon removal is really not in a position to win a fight like that right now, where the carbon removal, it doesn't make sense to take money away from industrial decarbonization and use it for carbon removal, right? And so I think it's really hard to make the case that you should do something meaningful on carbon removal by cannibalizing something else. It needs to come with new money. And in the US and kind of around the world post-COVID, there was this stimulus moment, right, where we needed new government spending, and that's where every kind of macroeconomic conversation was. And so there was a window to do something on new spending. And now those macroeconomic and geopolitical conditions have completely reversed, where there's no appetite for big public spending on future-oriented innovation efforts. Folks are looking to cut fiscal spending and figure out how to focus on near-term affordability. And there really isn't that strong of a near-term affordability story for carbon removal, right? It's not going to somehow enable more electrons to come on the grid more cheaply, and that's what people care about. It's about cleaning up from those electrons and from electrons that were produced with fossil fuels in the past. And so I think that's the big challenge, is figuring out what is a politically salient story today that does not require massive new public spending, which is just not really the art of the possible for the vast majority of the governments that are thinking about this.
I guess this resonates a lot with my experience, because when you went in initially, it almost sounded like you were trying to get a group of countries to chip in to do the same thing. Then you kind of evolved to, I think, a more pragmatic approach where you were basically like, we can pool different things into one thing that looks like the same thing, right? But governments will approach it differently, and that's fine. And as long as the overall commitment is sizable, it doesn't matter if it's a procurement here and a subsidy here and so on. My experience is very much that when money is mobilized for carbon removal, it's so context specific, and it takes so long to get something done in one specific country, especially in this environment, that it sounded really, really hard to kind of, even if you were flexible in terms of what it is, to get it all at the same time from all these different countries. Because as we mentioned public health earlier, right? It's a really good observation you made, that that's been going on for many, many, many years. And so I guess it's more harmonized. Different countries have similar spending when it comes to public health in terms of categories, right? Whereas carbon removal, every country is doing something different right now.
Yeah. And we don't have high-level leadership on carbon removal. I think probably the Canadian PM, Mark Carney, is as close as we've ever gotten to a politician who even knows what it is, let alone supports it, right? But it requires some sort of critical mass, right? Carney can't stand up at a Davos speech and say, hey, we all need to do carbon removal, if nobody has any clue what he's talking about, right? And so I think we need to be moving up into the dialogue in terms of what types of leaders are thinking about this, figuring out better stories to tell in order to motivate those resources. And I mean, I think we have those, right? That there's been this real shift into thinking about carbon removal as the co-product, not as the primary thing. How do you embed carbon removal into agricultural operations, into industrial operations, into adaptation efforts, right? And then you're not even necessarily thinking about it as a project-based carbon credit. You're just paying for some sort of activity that results in carbon removal. And so I think there's a much more compelling story in many places today along those lines, because you're talking about resilience, you're talking about clean air and clean water, right? Things that do affect people much more today than the promise of 10 billion tons per year of carbon removal in 2050, where none of us are thinking about what problems we're going to need to solve then. So
Yeah,
I think it's possible.
Just one last thought there, and to bring back to a theme that you said earlier, I just came back recently from shooting a short documentary on wildfire prevention through the use of biochar, right? And this is a good example where
Exactly.
in the Mediterranean, for example, Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Greece, they all face the same problem when it comes to droughts and wildfires, right? And so if you have a solution that maybe helps with something like that, you could get a group of countries together to support something very specific, which then also does carbon removal, right? But yeah, this is also why I'm thinking more and more that could work potentially. But the carbon removal is a side benefit. It's not the primary thing that would move people at this time. But yeah, just as an example. But Eva, how you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, because I think those who have worked on carbon removal for a while now have also kind of graduated from this. We need X amount of billion tons by X year to needing new narratives that are different. And we see different work being put out on how that new narrative should look like in practice. But I understand that you still believe that AMC could be one of the options on the table in the future. It could work. So what is your vision of these stepping stones that will take us there, and this time successfully? I
Yeah.
understand the first one is kind of building the new narrative and getting it to higher political levels.
Well, I think one is finding a market that is willing to put in a small and potentially growing floor for carbon removal on the emission trading side. It could be Europe, it could be Corsia. There just needs to be some sort of market, even California, right, where a couple million tons a year of demand would be a huge tailwind for the field. And we don't have that anywhere yet. Even if it costs $500 a ton to do carbon removal, and you wanted to do that on 1% of the credits, it would raise carbon credit prices by what, $5 a ton, right? So it's not in conflict with an affordability effort in any meaningful way, but it would have these enormous benefits for technology innovation in the same way that Massachusetts didn't say you have to get all of your energy from solar. It specified a very tiny percentage back in the day, and that tiny percentage really mattered. We need to do that. I think there's also just a supply side piece of this, which I didn't fully appreciate, which is we need to get commercial scale projects built, not hundreds of tons or thousands of tons or even tens of thousands. We need to get to that 100,000 ton per year scale across lots of different geographies, across lots of different solutions. And those projects fall in a really, really difficult financing and operational valley where they still have tech risk because nobody's built something at that scale before. It's a lot of credits that they need to sell into a voluntary market that isn't growing that fast. And it requires more money than a venture capitalist is reasonably expected to put on the table. But it's also less money than is needed for a big infrastructure fund to take it on. So it has venture risk, but infrastructure like returns, neither of them want to take that bet. And so it's just really challenging. And I think figuring out how to do this through brute force to get a couple dozen commercial scale projects up and running really, really changes the narrative in the same way that the Iceland Climeworks project, however many years, a decade ago, seeing something real and understanding its promise is just so powerful. And we need to see that at commercial scale now to understand that this isn't just a fun science experiment, but an actual set of industrial technologies or agriculture technologies or wildfire prevention, and it needs to work. And so I think if you can put those two pieces together, then you get to the place where the technologies are ready for scaling. The standards, the political will has been proven that it works, right? And you can start to come together and think about harmonizing and scaling in a way that we hadn't. We definitely don't have today, let alone a couple years ago.
No, if you went back a year and a half ago when you started probably thinking about this concept, or what would you pitch today if you were somebody who spent the next year trying to unlock demand from governments? What would you be working on?
I think it would be figuring out where you can do one of two things. One is integrate into an ETS system via a mandate, or figure out where you could get subsidies for projects across the solution spectrum that were not seen as carbon removal projects or even CCS projects per se, but were seen as these kind of embedded industrial agriculture, et cetera, projects. And think about not necessarily going to the energy ministry that has funded CCS and has expanded into CDR, but thinking about where are the other sources of funding that you could have potentially bigger co-benefits, if you will, early on, thinking about agriculture, foreign aid, that type of investment, and see where you could get significant project support.
Which countries? You said you spoke to 24 countries. So where would you send people now?
Mostly the European, kind of the northern countries across the G7, usual suspects, right? And again, folks, we're doing cool things. Australia produced their first ever carbon removal roadmap last year. I think that's a really encouraging step forward, right? Like, you need to have a lot of these foundational things in place. But now the question is, how do we very quickly move from, okay, we're all doing things individually, to now we need to create that market demand and we need to finance big projects. And if we can do those two things, I think we're lining those up around the world. I'm cautiously optimistic, and hopefully it will be less of a February 2025 optimism and more of a cautious optimism about what is possible going forward.
So what does it mean for you? Are you in the waiting mode for this being figured out in different jurisdictions, or are you actively pushing and working on making it happen faster?
So my focus right now is actually turning more towards the US these days. In some regard, I think the US, this is the perfect time to think about policy change in the US, because the art of the possible is almost nothing. And we have no clue what the world is going to look like in a couple of years. And what happens is, if you get to a time where there is a window to do something, you can't be thinking up policy ideas then. Things must be pretty well vetted by the time the window opens. And so right now is a really important window in the US to, I think differently. Like, what are the big types of policies that we need that are basically not 45Q? And I think we kind of stumbled into 45Q as an avenue of the main policy tool in the US. But there's a dozen other different things that we could do that were not politically feasible in the past 20 years, but could be in a couple years. And so how do we start to think about what some of those things are? And how do we start to get those on paper and figure out where we might build unusual coalitions and start to think about that, so that when the window opens next, we're ready and we have a really ambitious agenda that is much more durable than what we've seen kind of with broader climate policy here in the US. Though I will admit, the carbon removal tax credits have been very durable, and I think are an exception to the story that kind of nothing is possible across administrations, because it actually is. And it's shown why bipartisan policy can actually work.
I think at this point, I'd also, at the end now, give a shout out to your Substack, because you've been very prolific at writing on all sorts of topics: AI and CDR, affordability and CDR, 10 ideas for the DOE of the future. So for anyone who's not yet subscribed to Noah's Substack, go there, because roughly once a week I see you posting stuff, which is very nice.
Probably won't be that cadence for long.
And then, hopefully we'll have plenty of things to discuss in the future and have you back on. But thanks for today. It was really, really interesting to talk to somebody who's, I think, probably no one pretty sure no one has spoken to this many governments about CDR. So yeah, really appreciate it.
Well, that's
Noah.
very kind. It's my pleasure. Always happy to join, and good talking to you both.
Thank you, Noah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.